Garden.
All right, welcome to Torture Garden. I'm Jimmy,
I'm Scott.
and today we're going to talk about John Coltrane. For those who don't know, it's been over 50 years now since John Coltrane's passing down in, I think it was July 16th, 1967. And, the music world today is, obviously a lot different than it was back then. And I think, but I think that there's a huge part of that is because of Coltrane and because of the legacy that he left behind.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, when we talk about jazz, Coltrane and Miles Davis, there are certain names that always come up when we talk about great jazz musicians, but there's not always a lot of explanation of why they're great and what they did. And so, we thought it would be a good idea to talk today about, why Coltrane is such an important force in jazz and why his music still resonates with people today. So, Scott, how did you end up getting into Coltrane anyway?
I remember back at our town library when I was growing up, kind of like what you mentioned, is when I did my own research and looking on sites like Rate Your Music and Wikipedia and stuff. No matter what era of jazz you're looking to get into, almost certainly there's a Coltrane album at the top of the list. Whether it's modal jazz or bop or free jazz, or avant-garde jazz, spiritual jazz, there's always a Coltrane album, whether it's at the top or it's near the top or, just throughout the list, no matter what aggregate you're looking at or what, piece or think piece or whatever. So obviously he seemed like a good person to look to if you want to get into jazz. So I remember initially I took out Giant Steps,
Great album.
My favorite. I think it was just Giant Steps and My Favorite Things, and both those albums are great for different reasons.
Oh yeah.
But my jazz phase I think around that time I also got into Kind of Blue by Miles Davis and Sketches of Spain.
Also a Coltrane recording.
Yes.
Kind of Blue. So.
But I think my jazz phase kind of faded, and it wasn't until quite a while later, when we even get beyond talking about great jazz albums, we get about talking about great albums of all time. That I kind of revisited Kind of Blue, got into that, and I'd never listened to A Love Supreme before, and listening to that. Really, I know we have differing opinions about that album.
Yes, we do, and but we will talk about that. So,
yeah, but I loved the album. I mean, I thought it was phenomenal, and as I got more into jazz, it just, again, that initial thought I had about his place in jazz history, regardless of what genre or period of the genre, what subgenre, what style. He was always there, and there was a good reason why he was there, because all the music he produced was phenomenal. His playing, not only his playing, but his composition, just every aspect of who he was as an artist was just, really everything that I wanted jazz to be. Everything I need in terms of, do I want a chill, jazz album for the background? I'll put on Duke Ellington and John Coltrane. In a sentimental mood is perfect. Relaxing, smooth jazz. If I want something hard hitting and just well composed, well played, just right in your face, bop. You can put on Blue Train, you can put on Giant Steps. If I want something more spiritual, Love Supreme. Or then if I want some crazy, or free jazz or whatever, it's not something you have to look to. People often cite, Ornette Coleman, or even today, they'll go to all the new people who are really pushing, the extent of free jazz. People like Colin Webster, Mats Gustafsson, that's
Henry Threadgill.
Yeah, exactly. What people think of for free jazz, but really some of Coltrane's free jazz stuff is some of the best free jazz sax I've ever heard, and it just, I think for me the reason he's so important is just the groundwork and what he laid for so many different styles of jazz. It is just. I can't think of really many other artists or any other artist that really rivals him, except maybe Miles Davis. But
Yeah. I totally I get you there. Yeah.
and even
I
then, it's interesting because I feel like um, Davis and Coltrane really did cover a lot of the same ground, except when they got into their more experimental phase. Because
mm,
obviously Davis really diverged into fusion, and Coltrane really diverged into free jazz and avant-garde jazz and whatnot.
I
Um,
mean I would consider Davis's version of fusion to be very avant-garde anyway,
yes,
but
that's
yeah.
that's fair. Absolutely, that's a fair point. Um,
Yeah.
but he never really got free. Like, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Davis ever truly made a free jazz album.
I think not technically, because I mean, even from the start, he was pretty opposed to what Ornette
Yeah,
Coleman was doing.
yeah, and it wasn't
Um,
until later in his career that he kind of came around.
yeah, but I think even then, I think he used a lot of like guided improvisation, sort of,
Hmm. Hmm.
because like I always found that Bitches Brew, like, despite what people say about it, that it's just fusion or whatever, there's a huge amount of improvisation to it that you
Yeah.
don't see in any other jazz album. Like, it's even more free than his modal work that came before the Electric Era.
Hmm.
So, but yeah, I agree with your points about Coltrane. I think that I would honestly say that Davis probably did more for jazz than Coltrane did. It's weird because, like, we think Coltrane is like this founder of free jazz when I always see Ornette Coleman
Yeah.
as the founder of that. And like same thing with like the bop styles like in cool jazz and things like that. Like Miles Davis spearheaded all of those movements
Hmm.
pretty well, but I think it's Coltrane who refined them
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
sort of redefined what they meant. So I don't consider him like he's not. I think when I say he's forward thinking, I think it's not in the way that he's predicting all these genres. It's
Hmm.
more that his artistic ability is just so out there that he ends up redefining whatever he creates.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So, um, yeah,
And I
yeah,
think I think above all, he was just a phenomenal player. I mean,
yeah.
there's anecdote after anecdote from people who knew him that he just almost never put down that saxophone,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
and he just was
Yeah.
constantly playing, constantly pushing himself to be better. He just said he was restless
I mean,
in
you
becoming a
can
better
hear it.
player.
You can hear it in any recording that you can like. Coltrane's tone is unmistakable
Hmm.
in literally any recording he's in.
Hmm.
I've yet to hear something where I'm like, is that him or not? Like, I
Yeah.
think maybe Meditations because he's working with Pharoah Sanders and they're both sort of going into extended techniques.
Yeah.
But even then, like, there are sections of it where you're like, yeah, that's definitely Coltrane because the power that he brings and the clearness that he brings to his tone is something that doesn't you don't really hear a lot.
Hmm.
And it's just surprising to me how individualistic it is because I mean like there are so many jazz saxophonists out there who are amazing at what they do, and yet we have this one guy who you can tell who he is among all of them. You know,
Yeah.
I,
Exactly.
I always find that amazing, but I think maybe it's worth diving into Coltrane's career a little bit. I think
Yeah.
let's
Absolutely.
just so at like it's worth it's how early is early. I think because I would say that we could talk about his stuff before Miles Davis, but I honestly don't. I haven't listened to a lot of that. I find that I think he came. I think he got a lot of attention for being in the early Miles Davis quintet. And being in those relaxin' cooking albums.
Hmm.
I think that's sort of where I got like I think that's sort of where a lot of people I think got their first taste of Coltrane.
Hmm.
That and Blue Train, both
Yes.
of which redefined what hard bop is basically. And I think when it comes down to it, like I think it's funny because like I said before, Coltrane's an outsider. Like and he always sounds like an outsider, even on those albums. Like if you put on Blue Train, put on the title track, I nobody else is going his speed on it, or at least
Hmm.
if they are, they don't seem as confident
Yeah.
in what they're doing. Like, but like you put on that, you put on Giant Steps. Like he's just in there. Like I think he just always wanted to challenge himself, and so but he could always meet that challenge, which I think eventually what which is like sort of why he ended up going into free jazz. But we can talk about that a little bit later.
Mm-hmm.
You have any favorites from the early Coltrane years? Like,
Actually, I was thinking back as I was preparing for the podcast, and I have Blue Train on vinyl, and I was listening to that quite a bit this week.
yeah,
And I remember that's actually, I think, one of the first records I ever bought.
really?
It's a really, really good pressing, and it's a phenomenal record. And it's interesting to me that is his only recording as a band leader for Blue Note.
Yeah,
it's interesting.
I
to
thought
think
that was weird too.
Yeah, you have this of like,
Yeah.
Immensely iconic, and obviously at the time he wasn't as iconic, like, obviously, but you have this iconic jazz artist whom you'd assume would be associated more heavily with such an iconic label.
That's the thing. I think today,
Yeah.
Coltrane's place in music is undisputed,
Mm-hmm.
but back then he was not very popular. He was not very liked. He was very much in the same vein as Thelonious Monk.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sort of makes sense that they collaborated so much.
Yeah.
But they were both. I think because while everybody else was sort of going through the motions, like Davis had that sort of he had one foot in the future and one foot in the past, so he was able to sort of like while he was an outsider, he was able to sort of bring that outside in more. Coltrane was just outside to begin with. And I think that a lot of people couldn't deal with that, and so I don't think, his popularity really didn't rise. It took a while to really get up there for people to really count him as like, one of the big dogs in jazz.
Yeah, I mean, we see the same thing with other, Ornette Coleman's another great example.
Oh, yeah. Where, I mean, Ornette Coleman is, like, probably the most out there jazz musician, except for maybe Sun Ra. I think maybe Sun Ra would be more, but
even so, a lot of, I mean, obviously Sun Ra went into a lot of Afrofuturism and whatnot, and a lot of like weird territory. But a lot of his early recordings were very, very standard or relatively normal, quote unquote. Whereas I think even from the start, Ornette Coleman, some of his earlier stuff is, I guess, quote unquote, palatable to a degree. I could play it, and my mom wouldn't mind it as much. But there's always, he's always from the beginning had that undertone.
I mean, we're talking about a guy who got kicked out of marching band.
Yeah, exactly.
Because he was so different. We're talking about a guy who played a fucking plastic saxophone. I mean, yeah.
And I think along the same lines, you have someone like John Coltrane, where from today's perspective, it's odd that at any point he wasn't really seen in the same light, or the fact that he didn't have as many chances to release on Blue Note, which is arguably one of the most well-known.
Well, he was a lot of his best albums came out on Atlantic too, though.
Yes.
So it's worth saying that, but I think it's also worth saying that when you go back into the beginnings of jazz, where Coltrane sort of pops up is in that around the time that bebop was becoming the dominant force in jazz. Mm-hmm. And this was a time when most music was like but most jazz music was thought to be like like swing big band.
Yeah.
And so we were having people like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Max Roach, Charles Mingus, who were sort of stepping out of that and trying new things with smaller numbers. And they would take they would take jazz standards. They would take the same chordings, but they would actually write different melodies over those chord changes.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of the start of bebop. And even that was viewed as it took a while for people to really catch on to that. Because I mean that's just the way it is with not even with music, but with almost everything. People are very reactionary. They're tough. It's tough for us as humans to understand change and to deal with change.
Yeah.
And especially when it's something like music that is, very much a comfort for a lot of people. I think I think especially at the time that we're talking about, where America's still very religious, still very much in that sort of. I don't want to say like bad period, but definitely when it comes to progressive, social equality type of thing,
Yeah.
it's not ideal.
I
Um,
mean, in terms of the civil rights movement and whatnot, I mean, he was
yeah,
really operating at ground zero of the
yeah.
civil rights movement, and
I mean, I was thinking even before that. Like, I'm thinking of when Dizzy and Bird were
yeah,
really
hmm
like. I mean, that really wasn't even something that they were even thinking of then. In a way.
yeah.
So
I mean,
I think it's just like to say, to be someone in that area and to hear this music played by an African American. And it was just so radical at the time that I think it was very tough to get into. And so
yeah,
when we fast forward, a little bit, just a little bit, to when bebop is starting to evolve more into hard bop and post bop and that, and like Miles Davis starts going modal and things like that. You know, I think that Coltrane even being there was tough.
hmm
So like for people to view like those people that maybe grasp on to bebop pretty early, it was even tough for them to do something like that.
hmm
To go on to just the amount. I think part of the reason Coltrane was considered so weird back then was just because he was so complex.
hmm
Because you take a song like Giant Steps, it is immensely difficult. It's one of the most difficult jazz pieces ever. Just because of all the weird chord changes that happen through it. And it's a very advanced piece, and I mean, in a way, it sort of represents the pinnacle of what he did in that time. So to I think that's why it took so long for people to really grasp onto that, just because I mean, he was also he was very much ahead of his time, but he was also never really in a certain time
hmm
anyway. He was very original. I think that's part of it, is that and I think that it was sort of, I don't think he was one to give leeway, that like it was either you're gonna like this or you can just fuck off,
yeah,
like sort of like I don't think he cared so much about what people thought about it as his own opinions of his own music. So I think that goes into something. But I think during this time, we're talking about early Coltrane. I think Blue Train is definitely, like, it was not his first album, but it was probably his first really big album,
yeah,
really important album. And I really like Blue Train. I love the title track. That the beginning of that song is one of my favorite parts in jazz, I
hmm
would say, just because of just sort of the way it you know like I like to think of that beginning as like a prelude, in a way, that it's like you have no idea what's coming next, but it's just so interesting sounding that you just want to keep going.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. And then I think the other one that comes up, around this time, Giant Steps is the other one that comes a little later on Atlantic. And I think this is probably good. Like I was saying, this is sort of the beginning. This is definitely a pinnacle for him, because this was as complex as he got, and this was very, very, very complex. But after that, you start seeing an album. You start seeing like My Favorite Things, and it was
Yes.
also during this time that Kind of Blue came out. That Miles Davis was experimenting with modal jazz
hmm
instead of traditional chord changes and things like that. That he's freeing up the jazz musician from music structure as a whole a little bit. And so I think I've always find this little dichotomy very interesting, because you go from just, I mean, the insanity of Giant Steps. Like, if you ever listen to like a song like Countdown off of Giant Steps, it is some of the fastest playing you'll ever see or ever hear. And but then you go right to Kind of Blue, where you go to My Favorite Things, and Coltrane's speed is still there, but there's so much looseness
Yeah.
in his soloing, and there's much more freedom, and I think he starts caring a little more about melody, almost in a way. Different things become. I think his priorities shift
Yeah.
during this time. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I think, just listening to my favorite things, obviously
Mm.
everyone knows that that is a cover of one of the most famous songs from Sound of Music.
Well,
Um,
the entire album is just covers, um, but it's
yeah,
covers redone in a modal sense.
yeah, and
So,
obviously, that's the title track, most well known,
oh yeah.
and just the way he does, I think it's also a precursor to a lot of his more, um, spiritual endeavors, and a lot of his more,
Mm.
kind of, atmospheric and just, that type of emotion that he brought into his music. If you compare the original to his arrangement, it's amazing how he took the central theme and the emotion of the original song and completely changed it in a way that recontextualized it. I mean, that to me is the sign of a great arrangement and a great composer, is the way you're able to both nod at the source material in a way that feels respectful of it, but also recontextualize it in a way that pushes it in a different direction. And I think you mentioned something really important, is that his playing is still really fast and is really intense within the atmosphere of the song, which is a pretty laid back and smooth, easy listening experience. I think it was one of my favorite things about him, is even in compositions that are relatively laid back, he still has so much power and strength in his performance.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
I think that is a fantastic, and the fact that it brought a little something different, because correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think he really recorded a lot of alto sax
No,
before
he
My
did.
Favorite
This
Things.
was. I mean, not a lot of people in general recorded was. Well, it was. This was soprano sax.
Soprano, excuse me.
On my favorite things. Yeah.
Yeah,
But yeah, not a lot of people did that at the time, so that was a new thing. I think that was him exploring sort of different capability, sort of different pitches and sort
yep,
of what you could do with a high register instrument. Because normally he was a tenor. So yeah, it was interesting to see. You know, and then where are we? Oh, well, I was gonna say I've actually been listening to this. There's this really great little jazz the talk show that this guy has been doing that I found on iTunes University, out of all places. That he was talking about. I was listening to his Coltrane piece, and he was talking about that the track "But Not for Me" off of My Favorite Things is actually like I said before, bebop started with someone like Dizzy Gillespie, taking a jazz standard like "But Not for Me," keeping the chord changes, but then changing the melody.
hmm.
Right now, we have in this cover though, Coltrane does the exact opposite. Is that he uses the same melody that the Gershwins used in writing this, but then stuck in the chord changes from Giant Steps, which is I just found like really interesting that he was always, you know, trying something new and always trying to flip things on its head. And I think that's sort of like we always, something I always think about is what defines an artist. And I think that's sort of part of that, is that never ending experimentation, that wanting to just keep finding out more and more, that sort of realizing that you know you're never going to get to a peak of greatness, like you're never going to become perfect, but you're always trying to get there.
Hmm.
And I think that's really important. I think that's what kept him going a lot. But if we fast forward from this, if we fast forward from My Favorite Things, we come to Ole Coltrane, which was his last album for Atlantic,
Hmm.
and really one of his last albums that had him doing a normal sort of setup. But even Ole was very strange.
It was, yeah, absolutely.
I love the title track though. That probably, I would probably count this as my favorite Train song. bar none.
Really?
Yeah, because I don't know if you have the same thing, but whenever I listen to this, it has this tension to it, like this sort of anxiety to it
Hmm.
that you don't really hear a lot in jazz. And you would think that, oh, like having something like that in such an art form as jazz that is always associated with like mood and
Hmm.
always with like coolness and sort of flexibility. To have that anxiety in there was very like just very odd, and I really grabbed onto that a lot. And I think if I'm correct, I think he's actually playing flute a little bit on no, I'm sorry, that's actually
That's
Eric.
Eric. Yeah,
Yeah,
Eric
it's
Dolphy.
Eric
Yeah.
Dolphy. Yeah, but I thought that just the fact that you had like these different instruments doing this on a track that was almost 20 minutes
Yeah.
too. I really I thought Olay was just a great album. And it's definitely like it works the same way that like Nefertiti does in Miles Davis's discography, or like Milestones, which
Hmm.
Coltrane was also on Milestones. But that it's sort of bridging two parts of his career, because if we fast forward from there, we go to Impulse Records, and that's where some of the most important Coltrane albums came.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we have like we have like Africa Brass, which is I think a very underrated album.
Oh, absolutely.
Not a lot of people talk about Africa Brass as much, which is sort of sad because it's you know it's good. I think Crescent's also really good, but it doesn't come until 1964 that Love Supreme comes in, and we definitely have different opinions on this
We
on Love
do.
Supreme.
Yes.
Yeah, I I I think before I've said to you that I will not deny that it's a bad. I will not deny it's a good album, because I think it's a great album. But I think it's sort of people use A Love Supreme as a way to overlook other things in the Coltrane discography. Like people will just look at Love Supreme, and then they won't bother with like Meditations or Ascension, or even like some of the stuff that came after he died, like Interstellar Space, or like or Sunship. You know, so I I I think I think also from a personal taste, I never quite latched on to A Love Supreme as much as other Coltrane albums. And I think part of it, and this is going to be strange, it has to do with sort of how well it blended, like sort of the burgeoning avant-garde tendencies of Coltrane with the traditional,
Hmm.
jazz type of archetypes. It did it, I think, on such a great level that it sort of annoys me almost, as strange as that sounds, because like I think, but my personally, like if I want to listen to free jazz, I'm gonna listen to free jazz. Or if I just want to listen to regular, if I just want to listen to some bebop, I'm just gonna put on Art Blake, or I'm gonna put on Blue Train or something like that. So to have something that's right in the middle of that isn't really my jam as much.
Hmm.
Which is why I've always discounted a little more than I probably should have, because it is a hugely important album. I mean, because it really is one of those bridges between what we consider normal jazz, and then
Yeah.
going into experimental territory without really stepping too far into either. And it's one of those recordings that I think just I think it just has like a life of its own in a way, that it's sort of like sure, it came out in 1964, but in a way it's almost timeless, and not
Hmm.
like in the way that I think it just sort of stepped out of time and just sort of became its own thing,
Yeah.
if you get what I mean. But yeah, you really like Love Supreme though, right? That's probably
I
your favorite.
I love. Well, I don't see. I think for me, it's difficult. To go back to what I said at the beginning of this episode, is just that um, he does excel at so many different styles of jazz. It's hard for me to pick a favorite, but
Mm,
Love Supreme is certainly a favorite. And just speaking, quasi, just not maybe not objectively, but contextually, this is widely regarded as Coltrane's best art.
yeah, this is basically considered his magnum opus
Hmm.
in Pitchfork's 1960s best album, which was just released out a couple weeks ago now.
Yes, I think
It was what, like number 9 or 10?
Well, I think it was three.
Wait, it was three. Oh, I'm thinking of In a Silent Way. That's what I was thinking of.
I
Yeah,
think it went Coltrane, and then Pet Sounds, and then Velvet Underground, Nico.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
So I mean, to consider that, a jazz album, especially at a time when rock music was starting to take over,
yeah,
that's something right there.
but I think to me, so why I think that people really gravitate to this is because it really was that bridge, both at the time and in the future, or now looking back on it. I think the
Mm,
fact that most people aren't going to use this as an excuse, or they aren't going to gravitate to this and not explore his newer stuff just because for that reason. I think they're going to do it because they don't really like the direction he went in. Obviously his newer material, or his the latter half of his career
mm,
was full of extremely challenging music that probably most people don't want to listen to. I think why A Love Supreme really stands out is because of its status as kind of a bridge album, as kind of a pivotal album in his discography. It really did grasp onto that relatively accessible jazz that the people had been accustomed to. There were things within in the album that people you know can align with in terms of, okay, this is jazz. But then it moved forward into that the spiritual aspect that he really started to explore on this album. Um, that avant-garde territory he really began to experiment with. I think the fact that it distinguishes itself with those elements on top of having that solid jazz foundation that Coltrane had mastered up to that point and would continue to expand upon is really why people gravitate to this. Why I
mm,
personally love this album so much is I think I feel the same way you do in terms of it being a bridge album in the way that it is able to balance those as much. But to me, that's its greatest asset. Is it's interesting to listen to it not only because of the context. I find it interesting to listen to albums that were so pivotal, just to kind of draw my own comparisons to what came afterward, and just to kind of appreciate the music for what it eventually would do to the landscape of the subgenre or genres it influenced. But I
mm.
really do enjoy, that niche it operates. It really is a unique jazz album to me because there are I don't want to listen to Peter Brötzmann firing away, every day of the week, and I don't want to listen
Yeah.
to a really smooth, something like In a Sentimental Mood by Duke Ellington and John Coltrane. Like, there are times where I'm not really in the mood for something that's wicked abrasive, and I'm not in the mood for something that is just so relaxed and isn't really grabbing me. And I feel like A Love Supreme operates really, really beautifully in the middle of those two extremes, and it's
Yeah.
impressive to me that he was able to do that. So I think for me, the reason I latched onto it is because of its contextual um, influence and importance, as well as just the way the music was able to balance everything he had done and would do in such a succinct statement. Um,
Yeah, I get you. I mean, I think like I said, like I don't hate the album by any means. I really like it. I think I like some other of his stuff a little more. But I do got to give major props to the second track, Resolution. That freaking that freaking lick that he does is so
yes.
memorable.
Uh,
I it, I would almost consider it like the quintessential jazz, riff
oh yeah,
in a
that
way.
that opening riff is incredible.
Like I'd probably consider that, or like even like the styling is like like the first couple minutes of So What off of Kind of Blue.
Yeah,
Those would be like that's like quintessential jazz for me.
yeah, one of those
Um,
absolutely key,
yeah, just
key riffs that.
just like the amount of passion he puts into his playing in that single riff. Just I just get amazed every single time I hear it. Like I just have to sit down and just listen to it.
Mhm.
That's something I really like to talk about with you because we've talked about this before, but Coltrane and spirituality. I've read like a few Coltrane biographies that and really they haven't been very good in talking about this, this aspect of Coltrane, which was, probably the biggest part of his late career. The fact that, he was very interested in religion,
Mm-hmm.
in sort of, you know, realizing that, what he sees isn't all there is. And sort of that spiritual aspect of his, I don't think has ever been really documented as well as it should have.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that's always fascinated me is kind of digging into these influential artists and learning about what they listen to. You know,
Mm.
you think especially with these kind of really important early artists in a genre's formation. Oftentimes they didn't listen to necessarily. Obviously, he was very influenced by people that we mentioned before, like Charlie Parker and whatnot. Jazz musicians you'd expect him to be influenced by. But actually, yesterday I was watching a documentary where they interviewed people like Wayne Shorter and Rashid Ali and Alice Coltrane, his wife, and they interviewed a
Yeah.
lot of people and talked about his influences. And of course, they touched on the fact that he never put down the saxophone. He was always striving to be better. But something that interested me about Alice Coltrane, what she said is not only would he never stop playing, but he would also never stop listening to music. He was either seemingly only doing
Mm.
either one of the two. And what interests me most about what she then elaborated on is what he would listen to. He would often listen to a lot of world music. She said
Oh
he would
yeah.
listen to a
Yeah.
lot of classical music from South America, from India, from Asia. He wasn't necessarily only listening to other jazz musicians, his contemporaries or people who came before him to get influence. He was listening to a myriad of um, other types of music that weren't
Yeah.
necessarily popular in America. Obviously there were classical music from other countries, and especially the Indian classical music he gravitated to. And I know he had some, connections, or he had a few friends who were, spiritual in that regard. But they brought something to his music very clearly. That free expression and that kind of feeling of attaching to the divine. And I think that really helped accelerate his career, because when you have someone that is that passionate about music and is that passionate about being better and striving to be better, and then you add on a spiritual aspect, obviously your religiosity and spirituality often drive people to then go even further than they've been before. So when you have
Mm.
someone who's already proven, like Coltrane, to always want to strive to be better and do something different and live, outside of the boundaries that have been before, and then you add on a deep spiritual connection to that, I think that's completely integral to how his music evolved and him as a person. And it's unfortunate that I feel like that would have, evolved even further and done even greater things if he had lived longer. But I totally agree with you there. I
Maybe.
think that's an
See,
incredible
I
part of his career.
yeah, I think it's interesting to point out that, even though he has all these huge influences from world music, you don't really hear them show up in his own music as much, or at least not in
Yeah.
the traditional way. Like if you
Uh
listen to
huh.
Alice Coltrane's, some of her
Yes.
recordings, they have a lot, like she actually includes like Indian instruments and
Hmm.
like Arabic instruments within the recording itself, and obviously takes that world influence on a bigger level. But I always felt like, like looking back at it, I think Train always sort of, took his music and he took those influences and I think he filtered them through his saxophone. So like I think through the traditional jazz lens, because I think, what, like I mean he named his son Ravi after Ravi Shankar, and I think it's worth saying that, like something like raga, which was, a very different and very influential type of music that sort of was completely opposite of what Western music was doing.
Hmm.
I think to take that, I think he sort of just he sort of tacked onto it in his own way, and I think he sort of translated it through what he knew.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting because usually, like when somebody says they have a world influence, or they take, or like somebody takes world influence, it comes up much more distinctly. Like I think of like Talking Heads in like Remain in Light, how
Hmm.
there's a lot of tribal drumming in that, or like David Byrne and Brian Eno's collaboration, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, even that is like you
Yeah.
can hear more of those influences. But with Coltrane, it's very he still keeps it within jazz.
Yeah, and I think that's very interesting, as you mentioned. Alice Coltrane, very obviously has those influences on display.
Yeah.
Pharoah Sanders, is another
Oh
artist
yeah.
that very
Yeah.
much. And to speak to your point, I really can only think of Ohm. Ohm is a really, it was a one long song. It was a collaboration with Pharoah Sanders. Um, it's really one of the only points where that spirituality and that kind of those world music and what Eastern classical music influences come into play. So it really
Yeah.
is fascinating that he kind of what I was alluding to before is he took these influences and rather than necessarily splicing them into his music, he really kind of internalized
Mm.
those influences, and then, like you said, just funneled it through what he was doing and helped it to
Yeah.
inform his playing rather than necessarily informing his compositions, like in the sense of what was included on the record,
Yeah.
but what was included in
Exactly.
his playing. And I think
I
that's fascinating.
Yeah, because I think for him art and music had this intense spirituality to it
Hmm.
that I think he sort of grasped onto that fact that it was more about your own individual way of doing things rather than the right way. And I think that he sort of I think he very much internalized that and took that to heart, and I think that's why we have music like that.
Yeah.
um, let's go forward a little bit to probably his most divisive album by some people, Ascension.
Yes.
Because okay, when I say device, because I actually the first time I ever heard of Coltrane was when I was in college. I was taking a jazz poetry course, and there was I think we talked about it. Oh no, there's this Amiri Baraka poem that's just titled Train, or no, it's called Amtrak, and it's worth checking it out sometime. I think there's some recordings of it on YouTube of Amiri Baraka actually performing it.
Hmm.
But it's very much in the realm of like free jazz, but it's poetry. And so I had never heard like even a poem like this, and my professor was like, the Coltrane put out this album called Ascension that was just big band free jazz, and I tried to listen to it. Then I could not get into it. It was one of the toughest listens I ever had. I think I maybe got through a minute of it, and then I had to get out of it because I just couldn't take it.
Yeah.
But when I returned to it after listening to a lot of other free jazz, it's probably my favorite free jazz album. And I say that with regards to Ornette Coleman's free jazz, which I always find the similarities between those two to be very odd. Like, I don't know. You get what I mean there?
Yeah, free jazz has always been an interesting album. Um, Actually, all of Ornette Coleman's free jazz has always
Oh
been
yeah.
interesting to me because it's not. Obviously, it is free jazz, but he had this way of performing that really was, very bluesy and rooted in, that kind of
What
style and those kind of
what was it
notes.
called? It was Harmonolytics, I think.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
so. So it didn't come across. It didn't come across the way that you would normally think of as free jazz, which is interesting because he's a pioneer. But even to me, it feels a bit different from the kind of free jazz when you just want to put on something that's free like that. It's a little bit different.
Mm.
But then you have something like Ascension, which just in its scope, just in the people on the record. I mean, the lineup on this is truly incredible. You have Freddie Hubbard, Coltrane,
Who was also on free jazz too, by the
yeah,
way.
Coltrane, Pharoah Sanders,
Yeah.
Artie Shep, McCoy Tyner, Elvin Jones, a longtime drummer for Coltrane.
Oh yeah.
Um, but yeah, it just this record. I remember the first time we listened to it was actually we were going to visit a friend up the lake, and it's just listening to it. is just uh, to have that much intensity, and that much going on, to have that huge free jazz ensemble. Um, it truly, it really speaks to his ability to approach free jazz from really any angle. Because not
Mm-hmm.
only is this one of my favorite free jazz albums, another one would be Interstellar Space. How,
Yeah.
and that is literally a fraction of the lineup on Ascension.
I mean,
Whereas
well, like actually, I think it's for Sheeta Lee in Interstellar Space, right?
yes, I believe so.
Yeah,
But
but yeah,
that's the thing.
but like when it comes to personnel, yeah, it's
Yeah,
you're talking about like a very small.
exactly.
Yeah.
On Ascension, you have two trumpets, two altos, three tenors, piano, double bass, or two basses, drums, and then you have Interstellar Space, where it's literally just Coltrane and Rashida Lee, drums and sax, and that's it.
Oh,
And
and Coltrane playing sleigh bells,
yes, those as
which,
well.
which has always sort of perplexed me.
Yeah.
Because whenever I hear sleigh bells, I think, oh, Santa Claus is
Yeah.
coming. And so like to hear that sort of show up, I'm like, okay, like like it works. It's just so it sort of takes me out of it for a second. But yeah, I just I feel like we could almost devote an entire episode of Torture Garden to just talking about the difference between Ascension and free jazz, because like even though they have almost an identical lineup, and but with Freddie Hubbard being the only person who was actually on both, um, at the same time they're so different.
Yes, incredibly
I,
different.
which I mean, I'm trying to think about how I would describe that difference. I would almost say because the free jazz it's that's just the first part of the title. It's free jazz, a collective improvisation.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it differs because I think Ascension, I think it still has a little more structure to it because I think I think free jazz was just a collective improvisation, but I think Ascension was taking a big band and doing something free with it. Like I think it's more it's definitely it's much more focused towards something. Even though it has its chaotic moments, it doesn't. If you look at the structure of it, it very much switches between solo ensemble, ensemble. It doesn't really like when it comes to that. It's not very different, but at the same time, it's it feels completely improvised. So, and I think in a way it sort of was.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. When we talk about free jazz and free improvisation, it's very it's with a very loose emphasis on free because rarely is this music is this music really invented on the spot because it usually comes from other musicians or for musicians trying out different things. It's more that it's more like free jazz just offers just a space to use that freedom to play whatever in, and it's sort of being in the moment, but at the same time you come up with the things that you play based on what you've played before. So I think it's worth thinking that going into this. I think and really this was the last really big Coltrane album before his death, right? Well, no, Meditations came right after it, which is one of my personal favorites.
And you have Kulo Se Mama.
Yeah, that came before Ascension, though.
Did it?
Yeah.
Oh. It says it was released.
Well, it was yeah, you're right. It was released in '67, but I think it was recorded before that.
Yeah, I think it was too. But yeah, then after that, I mean, those are the last major things he released, and then,
but then the stuff that comes after. I mean, Interstellar Space was amazing.
And actually, Om was a posthumous release, and I personally think Om is one of his most underrated products. I love Om. Interstellar Space is incredible, and that came out quite a few years after. It was recorded the year of his death, but it came out,
Yeah, like 10 years later.
Yeah, almost 10 years later, which
Yeah,
is
you know what I really like about Interstellar Space, and you sort of touched on this early, is that, just the lineup itself, I find to be really important because I think what I've always find interesting about free improvisation and free jazz, besides the fact that, it's improvised music, is that really you can have any lineup.
mhm.
Because like you look at different genres, like a traditional jazz quartet is drums, bass, piano, and then some other instrument,
Yeah,
or piano trio is just piano, bass, drums, or you go to metal, you have lead, you have rhythm guitar, bass, drums, maybe vocals, but with and obviously there are exceptions to the rule. There are always exceptions to the rule when it comes to art. But you never see people really going and doing things different in those genres. Like it's not very often. Like I think what was that band that came out with a new album? Was it last year that they were just a bass and drum band? I think you reviewed them on Heavy Blog.
there's I mean, you have Lightning Bolt. I think the band you're referring
Oh
to is
yeah, Lightning Bolt too.
Mantar.
Yeah, Mantar. Yeah, but Lightning Bolt's a good example too. That of someone sort of redefining the norms of personnel lineups. But I think Interstellar Space really, I think shows that. Like, I think it really, in a way, sort of started that.
Yeah,
Because I like really, you listen to free improvisation recordings that come out today. They're with like any instrument in any capacity. Like there are some that are just solo saxophone. And then
yeah,
we have like something like that came out this year that was Peter Brotzman and was it Heather Lay? I
yeah,
think.
and that
Yeah,
was saxophone and
pedal steel.
pedal steel guitar.
Yeah, which is
Um,
like who would ever fucking think of that lineup? You know?
and then one of my favorite lines up is Colin Webster. He's a saxophonist from the UK. He had a lineup where he was on baritone sax, then he had Graham Dunning on turntables and effects, and then Sam Underwood on tuba, and they did free
That's
jazz.
cool.
Everybody like could that's such an incredible line. To think of going back to, as kind of what you mentioned, the big band lineup. The standard, you need to have these many horn players, these many whatever to make
Yeah.
this sound work. And now you can really approach jazz like any way with virtually pretty much any combination of instruments, more or less. Um, and I think you really, I mean, one of the people to credit with that is Coltrane, who
Yeah.
really helped push for the freeing of. Because I don't know, I mean, what even preceded Interstellar? I mean, I know it's kind of unfair because it was recorded in '67, but waited so long to be released. But I mean, was there really another jazz album that had that kind of setup where it was just so bare
I
bones? There
there
probably
probably
was.
are, but I just can't think of any that would be like that. But
Yeah,
I think it nonetheless stands out as just such an odd lineup that you don't really see a lot, even at that time.
yeah.
So I definitely, and I think I it's just it's we're coming to the end of his career. You sort of wonder what he would do if he hadn't died.
It's
Um,
interesting because obviously you've actually listened to the tail end of Miles Davis's career when he came back,
mm,
and at least from an outsider perspective, I haven't listened to much of anything that he did in the later part of his career.
it's not bad.
It's not bad, but does it live up to what he did before?
Well, I Miles Davis is such I think sometimes you can take somebody's late discography and sort of parse it apart. I think with Miles Davis it's a little bit different because he was always doing something different.
Yeah,
Like I mean, from the very beginning, like even when he was playing with Charlie Parker, he was doing something different.
yeah,
And so he's someone who spearheaded basically every major subgenre of jazz. And then when he came back, it's like, what do you do now? And
exactly.
so I think he sort of assembled like a piecemeal sort of sound. out of what was going on at the time.
Yeah.
But I just don't think it's comparable to anything else that he's done before, because it's always, it's always something different. But I would say that that era of recordings is probably my least favorite of his, even though there are some good albums there.
But I think that was just kind of the parallel, or just kind of an example. And there's plenty of examples of artists that kind of dropped off towards the end of their career. Obviously not to say Coltrane would have done that.
No, I don't think he would have.
I don't think he would have. But it is interesting to think about what what he might have done. Would it have been good? I don't think he would have made a bad album, and I don't think he ever did make a bad album. But would it kind of just been disappointing, or would it just not, like you said, not been one you would have really returned to as often, even if it has some merit? And I think the fact that he has such a wide body of work, he had maybe not as many as other jazz musicians, but he had a ton of releases, and they all touched on so many different genres. I don't feel like his discography leaves me wanting. It's not in the way of, like Eric Dolphy, for example. I think Eric Dolphy's discography was cut off way too soon.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I think that's a great example of someone who really had a lot that he could have offered, but unfortunately passed away too soon.
Yeah,
I don't really feel that with Coltrane. I think he did. He had such an impact, and he left such a rich, rewarding discography that it would have been nice if he could have explored that sound further. And who knows? A Monday morning quarterback, you never know what could have happened. But it's not a case like Eric Dolphy where it's like, God, it would have been amazing to see what else he could have done.
That radio show that I was listening to that I mentioned before, that guy said, he was like, I always think that if Coltrane hadn't died, that he would be playing like flute on a mountaintop somewhere. I can sort of see that, because throughout his entire career, his musicianship was about him. It wasn't about impressing anybody else. It was about, it was art for art's sake, but it was also, it was just because he loved music. And I think that that's a good segue into, really, let's just ask the question, why do you think he's so important? Because we always just talk about, oh, he's important, but we never really hear why. And I like to say it's because, I think it was just because he was original. I think that, and I think that's something that you could, it gets a little glossed over nowadays as being like a little like, I guess traditional to say, but like very colloquial, but there's something about sticking to yourself and realizing your own potential that not a lot of people realize, that because it's the artists of this world that sort of bring the world forward in a way. And I think that that's sort of why Coltrane, I think, is remembered so fondly, is because of that, because he never really went against his own wishes. At least that's what it always seems like. The things he recorded were, the steps that he made were steps because he was interested in it.
Absolutely.
But what would you think? Why would you consider Coltrane to be so important?
So and obviously this is a character, not a real person, but Mr. Holland's Opus. There is a scene where he's talking about, he hated Coltrane when he first listened to him, but just trying again and again and again to appreciate him, and then it just clicked. And I think, more so than with any jazz musician I'm aware of, I see his career as being something, especially people who grew up with him and followed his career, just the leap he took, and the constant as pushing himself to be a better composer, to be a better player, to just be better and make excel in the music he made. To follow that career, I'm sure must have been incredible, and to kind of appreciate what he did, and to have to learn to appreciate what he did. I think
some of my favorite music is music I didn't like right off the bat.
Yeah, I'm
But
with you there.
and I think, just growing up, I think that's why he's so important to people, growing up with him, or going along with him, just because of the evolution he represented for jazz and the evolution he represented for music. But for me, I think why he's so important is, especially for jazz, but just for music in general, he did represent that fearlessness. Like you said, he's an amazing example of an artist who, as you said before, is making music because of just the sheer love of songcraft, the sheer love of making great music. And I think that is really the key of making music that's exceptional, is just making it for the sake of it, and making it for the sake of making music that says something, and speaks to yourself, and speaks to the larger purpose. But I think, just to go full circle, what I said originally is, I think the reason he has had such a lasting impact is because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, he really has touched on virtually every major movement. And as you mentioned, he may not have spearheaded it like Miles Davis, and he may not have created these genres, but the impact he left and the way he approached these subgenres is truly incredible. And the fact that no matter what period of jazz you're looking to get into, he has a classic album to offer for that style. To me, that speaks volumes to his talent at both playing and composing. And I don't think there's a reason for anyone who's trying to get into jazz or enjoys jazz not to enjoy at least one Coltrane record. I would
Definitely.
I would love to meet someone who loves jazz but doesn't like John Coltrane. I think that would be almost an incredible oxymoron. A Coltrane hating jazz fan.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
So maybe that's also, so we're gonna end this. We're gonna talk about we're just gonna go lightly over what we think the essential Coltrane albums are. I think in order of, actually really in no order, but the essential albums, we would say Love Supreme, definitely.
Yeah.
Giant Steps. My Favorite Things, Blue Train, and Ascension. I think what we mean by essential is that these are the recordings that defined who he was. I think all his recordings defined him, but I think these are probably the most important out of all of those. But we also included like a lot of deep cuts too, because I think that Impulse era Coltrane is always worth picking up. I always try to look around to complete my collection of it, because I just have not found a single Impulse era Coltrane album that I don't like. But we're also, these little deep cuts, I think it's worth mentioning. Olé Coltrane, which is an amazing album.
Mm-hmm.
Meditations, which is a personal favorite of mine. It's very odd, sort of. I've always found it to be a little odd. It's an odd album. But Interstellar Space, Africa Brass, and his collaboration with Thelonious Monk, which there are a number of them, but we're just talking about, it's just called Thelonious Monk with John Coltrane. It has a picture of Monk on it. Mm-hmm. There's a beautiful rendition of Ruby, My Dear that opens it up. That it's probably my favorite version of Ruby, My Dear. And I say this as a very, very big Monk fan. Mm-hmm. And then finally, Kinda Blue. Because, although that, it was, a Miles Davis album, I think you can still see Coltrane doing his thing, but in a different setting. Mm-hmm. So, it's worth putting that there. But, yeah, so thanks for listening. Really appreciate it. If you're interested in hearing more, subscribe and, leave a comment if you have any ideas for what we should talk about next. Anything to say, Scott?
No, just to, thank you very much for listening, and I hope that if you weren't already interested in Coltrane's music, we've hopefully inspired you to revisit, what I think Jimmy and I both agree is one of the best discographies in jazz music.
Absolutely.
Like I said, it would have been nice to see where Coltrane had went if he had lived longer, but, even 50 years after his death, everything that he did accomplish is exceptional. Really, if you haven't dived into Coltrane's discography yet, this is perfect time to do so. So
All right.
thanks again for listening, and look forward to seeing you next time.
All right. Well, see ya.
Torture Guard.